So I'm going to talk about foreign aid in conflict. And so I was asked to provide a bit of a showcase of academic research and within 15 minutes. And this is particularly on this topic, this is kind of a tall order and for two ways. One is to make it interesting if it is academic research. So we'll see if I fail on that. And then, but the other is also in a room full of practitioners and individuals that have on-the-ground experience talking about foreign aid, humanitarian aid, and being in conflict zones. What can I add as an academic? And so I'll go through this, and I'm going to focus on one paper which was published a couple of years ago, which has caused a bit of attention and a bit of controversy. Others have written papers against it, and there have been people have been hired to find flaws in the data and that sort of thing. So you'll see once we get into it. And so just thinking about foreign aid, and hopefully by doing this, I'll actually show you the value of statistics or an academic perspective on this. And so, so if we think about foreign aid, it's kind of well known that it has benefits. That's the point of foreign aid. It's that you can deworm children, you can build schools, you can provide just cash directly that can be used for a lot of great things. However, there's also concerns with foreign aid. And that's not going to be surprising to anyone who's read a tiny bit or thought about this or has worked in this area. So for the typical project, and this is what's made a big impact in the academic world, evaluations of impacts of the project often don't exist at all, or even if they exist, they're kind of done in a not very good way. So things aren't randomized, so we can't evaluate them. And we've made progress on that. But there's also, the other issue is, well, even if we measure certain things, there's going to be other things which we don't even think to measure, right, which could be affected. And these things can often be negative. And so one of these things is actually conflict, right? So humanitarian aid, you go into an area, you're trying to prevent people dying from cholera, for example, and your aid has nothing to do with conflict, but there are people that are worried or have written books that are worried that aid may unintentionally foster conflict or have some impact on conflict. So here's do no harm, which we actually talked about in our session, or was a phrase that was mentioned. And these are three books. There's many books like this, not written by academics, but these are actually practitioners. So people on the ground who observed certain events and basically have written these up in books. Okay, and so let me just take you through these. So here's Mary B. Anderson in her book. So it says, experience shows that even when it is effective in doing what it is intended to do, so the aid might be good, aid too often also feeds into, reinforces, and prolongs conflict. Again and again, aid workers tell how their aid is distorted by local politics and misappropriated by warriors to support the war. And again, victims report that aid is enriching warlords or strengthening the enemy. So actually, when I entered this research, I wanted to understand how food aid, the effects, and I actually had all positive effects on my mind. I hadn't even come across this research. And then after reading this research, I heard some stories. And let me tell you the stories that you read in these types of books. So one story that you hear over and over is the Biafran Civil War. So this is 1967. There's an Igbo area in southeastern Nigeria that wanted to secede. This was because of conflict in the north and oppression in the north. And so a civil war started, led by a colonel named Odumegwu Ojukwu. And basically, the civil war started, but Nigeria was quickly on the offensive. So the amount of territory controlled by the Biafran state shrunk very quickly. Okay? But then what happened, and there's very different versions of the story, there was a humanitarian crisis. Foreign aid was brought in. Basically, the Nigerian government didn't want aid to come in or food to come in because they had laid siege on this area. On these planes which came in were guns as well as humanitarian aid. And the Biafran state also charged taxes and these sorts of things. Okay? So again, there's different versions. There's versions that say, well, the starvation was intentional by the Biafran state because they knew that more children that starved, the more aid that came in. I don't have a sense. I just know what I read. But some argue that the war continued 1 to 2 years longer than it would have otherwise. Okay? Otherwise, it would have been over very quickly. The Biafran state had shrunk. And so here, foreign aid, according to some, prolonged conflict. Okay? So another example I could give many examples, is following the 1994 Rwandan genocide, right? So upwards of 1 million, probably about 750,000 Hutu Rwandese fled to what was at the time Zaire, or Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And so the story here is that basically the former Hutu killers from the genocide were able to regroup and were provided protection and then aid, which allowed them to then strengthen and then engage in attacks on Rwanda. Okay? And then Rwanda counterattacked and armed the ethnic Tutsis in the eastern DRC, the Banyamulenge, and this led to the First and Second Congo Civil War. Okay? And even today, so conflict has been persistent. Even today, if you talk to rebel groups in the eastern DRC, the one thing they all have in common, the Congolese rebel groups, is their main motivation is to have the FDLR, the Hutu militia, who are still there, leave the country, right? And so the Congolese government isn't doing it, so they're forming these rebel groups to do it. So one story here that's often told is, well, foreign aid allowed these rebel groups to, or these groups to regroup, to strengthen, and as a result, you have subsequent conflict. Okay? So again, I'm not taking a side on is that accurate or is that not an accurate portrayal. And so the concerns you read about are, well, aid shipments and other resources are often stolen en route. Okay? Aid recipients can themselves be refugee warriors. So these are actually people who are engaging in conflict and they're receiving foreign aid directly. Even if you target aid and you give it to the right people who aren't involved in conflict, ex post it can be taxed, right? So in the refugee camp in Goma, there's lots of stories like this. And then often aid workers who are trying to do work in these very difficult situations have to work with rebel groups or those that have some capacity in violence in order to distribute aid, okay? So they're actually often hired and that might increase their legitimacy. So these are the concerns that are raised, okay? So, but there's a bunch of questions that I, as an academic, when I read these books, so are these representative? Sure, we can have stories, but I see the same, 5 stories told over and over and over. And so, sure, there's going to be 5 bad cases. And are these stories causal? So maybe everything would have been exactly the same if there was no humanitarian aid that came in, except a lot more people would have died, right? There could have been no causal effect just because humanitarian aid came in, and then we've had a lot of conflict in eastern DRC doesn't mean one caused the other. And so then that's kind of, as an academic, you're left with, well, how do I really know what the answer to this is? Okay? So this is where I'm going to come in with my research. So a simple thing to do would be, well, we actually have data on aid, and we have data on conflict. You can look across countries and years and look at what's the relationship between the two. Okay? So I think you can all see, well, that's going to be extremely problematic for a lot of reasons. It's like, if you went and saw, do people go to the hospital and then do they die? You might see a relationship, but we don't think that's causal. That the hospitals aren't killing people. So basically, need is greater when there's greater conflict. So that might cause a positive relationship between the two. Delivery is more difficult, though. So if a place gets really bad, then aid doesn't come in. That's going to cause a negative relationship. And then both of those things are going to be correlated with a whole host of other things. So failed states, poor institutions, ethnic cleavages, all these sorts of things, right? So running that regression, which if you do, you find nothing, there's no relationship, really doesn't tell you too much for these reasons. Okay. So what can you do? So this led me and my co-author Nancy Chen to focus on a particular type of aid. And so this is food aid, and it's wheat aid, which comes from the US. Okay, so 90% of US food aid is wheat. So you think of this as essentially food aid and wheat aid being synonymous. So what we do is we look at weather shocks in the US, right? And so what happens in the US is there's price support mechanisms, right? So farmers are guaranteed a certain price for their crops, and the government will actually buy and accumulate reserves, right, if there's a surplus of wheat that's produced, okay? And then what happens with those reserves, actually this is surplus, and if they have extras, they send them overseas as food aid, right? So the way to think of this is, in order to ship food overseas to another country, there actually physically has to be that food, and you have more of that food if there's a bumper crop in wheat, okay? And so that's basically what we do. Why does that matter? Well, this variation, which is coming from weather shocks in Midwestern United States, presumably is unrelated to what's going on in these developing countries that are having conflicts, okay? And so all of these issues come because there are things about the developing countries. So either there's more conflict initially, there's bad institutions, which are causing aid and causing conflict, right? Or conflict is. And so this is one strategy, which is a statistical strategy, to try and really get at the causal effect of, in this case, wheat aid or food aid on conflict. Okay? So if we just look at the data, so the analysis is going to be a lot more complex and detailed than this. You see variation in US wheat production. So we see there's a bit of a hump-shaped relationship, which we deal with in the paper, but a lot of variation year to year. Okay? And so what you can do is predict this as well with actually fine-grained satellite climatic data and use that variation if you think that this might be endogenous to conflict. Okay? And so this is aggregated across different years in the US, 1971 to 2006, which is all the data that are available. This is previous year's wheat production in the US, and then these are wheat reserves, right? So if we grew more wheat last year, then the reserves are higher this year. Okay, so this makes completely logical sense in terms of the storage of wheat. And then this is the initial wheat stock, so US wheat reserves, and then the amount of wheat aid that's given as food aid the following year. So you see a very positive relationship. So in some sense, this is mechanical. We know that most food aid is wheat. And if you, in order to ship wheat overseas, you need to have it in your reserves. Okay, and so this is exactly the story that I told. Okay, so that's the first part of this strategy. The second part is, well, if we think of wheat being produced and then accumulated and then shipped overseas, it's not going to be shipped overseas to every country equally. There are certain countries that receive aid, and particularly wheat aid from the US over this period, and some certain countries that don't. Okay? And so we can basically just group countries into those two categories or create a fancier measure. And the countries that don't receive wheat aid from the US, we can think of this as a control. It's not a random control, it's not randomized, but it is a control that we can then compare against those that do receive wheat aid from the US. Okay? So this is, again, just some aggregated data. The analysis is much more complex. This is previous year's wheat production in the US. And this is average incidence of conflict amongst all non-OECD countries that receive food aid from the US in general over that period. Okay? So there's a wheat boom in the US. A year later, on average, there's more conflict amongst these wheat aid recipients. Okay? And this is where the control group becomes important because a lot of other things could be driving this, right? Weather shocks could be correlated. The paper, we deal with all of these things. But you know, how do we really know this is causal? And this is where the control group is helpful. These are the same countries that you know, are otherwise very similar, but they don't receive wheat aid from the US. Okay? And again, in the paper, there's a lot you can do to try and make them more comparable. And so previous year's wheat production, you don't see this positive relationship between the average incidence of conflict. Okay? So that's basically, I think, what academics can add and statistics can add to people who are on the ground and have seen these and may have formed their own opinions about, you know, does humanitarian aid sometimes cause conflict? Does it? And when you talk to different people, the trouble for me in trying to understand, is there this general relationship? When you talk to different people, you get different answers, right? And so this is the one benefit of being a bit more agnostic, looking at the data and seeing what do the data tell us, okay? So in terms of magnitude, if the average country in the sample receives 10% more wheat aid, its conflict incidence increases by 4%. So it's very, very large magnitude, okay? So does this mean, and this is the last thing I'll mention, does this mean that we should not give food aid or even humanitarian aid? Okay, and so I think this is a bit of the stir of this paper was the view that this is what this is telling you. So first of all, this is a negative, right? But there's a lot of positives, presumably. That's why we give humanitarian aid. So that's, I'm not even listing that. But even absent that, okay, there's a few reasons that the paper goes through, or a few findings that the paper finds, or the research finds. So first, there's a lot of heterogeneity in that positive relationship. If you broke that down even more, so it's countries, and we can think of these as fragile states, that have a recent history of conflict. That's where all the action is. If it's even if you're a wheat aid recipient from the US, it could be very poor, but if you don't have a history of conflict, then you don't have effects, okay? And so these estimates are for food aid from the US. And what a characteristic of US food aid, and particularly more recently, is that the food is sent in kind. Okay, so these aren't monetary transfers, which might have very different effects. And you can think of some of the mechanisms where like the food aid is physically being stolen and then sold for guns, for example. And so more recently, food aid policy is in kind or cash transfers, which are used to buy products locally or from a nearby country. And so those effects could be very, very different. Okay? And then the effects likely depend on what precautions are taken during the distribution. So this is 1970s, 80s, 90s. Could be that this is before those books which I highlighted were written. No precautions were taken at all. So if we actually are aware of this and take precautions, the effect might be very, very different, right? So that's the effect conditional on the history of U.S. distribution or distribution of U.S. aid during that period, right? And those books, the Mary B. Anderson, the book I really, really like is, because it's almost like a handbook for practitioners. What are the things you can do if you're in this environment giving food aid to basically make it less attractive to rebel groups and more suitable for. And so one was, if you have bags, for example, bags of rice or wheat, cut open every bag, right? And these can be carried home by a small group, a small family, but it makes it much less attractive for a whole rebel group to steal a whole caravan where all the bags have been cut open. And so she has lots of tricks or examples like this. Okay, I think that's all I have to say. Hopefully I didn't go over too much. Whoever's keeping time. Thanks.